Billy King changed the NBA forever. And that's because, did you know that the Brooklyn Nets were supposed to be one of the best teams today, having star basketball players like Jason Tatum, Jaylen Brown, and Damian Lillard potentially on the same team? But instead, the Brooklyn Nets will go down in history, and their struggles has continued to this day. But what really happened? In this video, we are going to look at one of the NBA's most awful stories, a story of a literal death of a franchise that was caused by one man, and that is Billy King. Now, King made a series of decisions that brought a huge change to the now Brooklyn Nets, and King's decision left Brooklyn stuck for years, whereas the Portland Trail Blazers got better and the Boston Celtics eventually becoming a dominant force. And it all started with a couple of key moves that made everything spiral. Now let's take a look at how it all went down. Now this first began back in 2011 when it was the New Jersey Nets, as they were in a tough spot. They were moving to Brooklyn, but they didn't have a big star to get people excited. They needed a name, a player who could fill seats in their new arena and make waves in the city. And Billy King was brought in as the general manager, and his plan was simple: get a superstar no matter the cost. He wasted no time. Almost 14 years ago, back in February of 2011, his first big move was to trade away Derek Favors, Devin Harris, and an unprotected first-round pick in 2011, which turned out to be Enes Kanter, plus another pick in 2013, which ended up being Gorgie Jang, to the Utah Jazz for Deron Williams. At the time, it seemed like a good deal. Deron Williams was an all-star and the kind of big name the Nets needed, and that was to pair him up with a young and talented center in Brook Lopez. Unfortunately for them, things didn't go as planned, especially since Deron Williams never got healthy. He had a series of injuries, specifically to his ankles, and the Nets, they didn't have a good enough roster. So what they did instead, this trade kicked off a pattern of risky moves where they gave away their future for short-term gains. Now on to March of 2012, the Nets were feeling the pressure. With Deron Williams in place and Brooklyn's big debut on the horizon, they needed to make a move. King then took another big risk by trading for Gerald Wallace. Wallace was a former all-star forward, and at the time it seemed like a perfect move. But what did they give up? Sean Williams, Mehmet Okur, and a first-round pick. Now, initially it didn't seem that bad, but here's the issue. The Nets, they ended up missing the playoffs that year, and that first-round pick was top 3 protected, and eventually ended up being the 6th overall selection, and the Portland Trail Blazers, they ended up selecting Damian Lillard. Yes, that Damian Lillard, the multi-All-NBA, multi-All-Star, the same guy who led the Blazers to several consecutive playoff appearances, multiple big-time game-winning shots in the playoffs, and is still playing at a high level in today's game. And again, at the time, it felt right. Wallace was supposed to bring that grit the Nets needed, but in hindsight, it's clear that this wasn't the big win that they thought. Wallace didn't live up to expectation. He dealt with injuries, only lasted a season and a half before getting traded away. Now, some people even said that King didn't even want Wallace to begin with. That trade came after failing to land Dwight Howard, and King couldn't have known what he was giving up, or could he? While some say that Wallace brought leadership, it's clear that it was still patching a gap. It's really hard to justify when the pick that was traded turned into one of the best players in the league, and that's what makes this mistake hurt even more to this day. But the truth is, at that point of the deal, it looked like the best option, which leaves us wondering, could the Nets have waited, or was their urgency their downfall? Now fast forward to July of 2012. After having a series of bad trades, Billy King was still not done. The Nets brought in Joe Johnson from the Atlanta Hawks, a multi-time all-star, but the bigger problem was money. The team brought in another player that was making a huge contract. Combine that with Gerald Wallace, Deron Williams, and Brook Lopez, it was only so much one team could take. And Joe Johnson's a good player, but he had a price tag of a $120 million contract, even at that time, which just furthered the risk that they were taking. Yes, the cost was steep. The Nets traded away expiring contracts and a future first-round pick, which became Shane Larkin, tying themselves even more financially. The idea? To form a big three with Johnson, Williams, and Wallace. The hope was they'd lead the team to a title. But even with Johnson's solid performance, the results didn't follow. The Nets made the playoffs, but that's about it. Their championship dreams faded fast. They were stuck with an aging core, a huge payroll, and no way to improve. Now, when Billy King brought in Joe Johnson, it felt like he was risking everything on a long shot. The problem wasn't Johnson's ability, but the way it's limiting everything else. That's what ruined their chances. There were some others that said that the contracts were too big. Fans commented later saying that this was proof that the team wasn't building for the future. They wanted immediate results. But here's the question. With such a deal that looked quite catchy at the time, can you really say this was all just a gamble? There were also some comments about the trade when it didn't meet the expectation that even though the contract was crazy, if Johnson had worked out, people would have said it was worth it. But the reality is that Johnson's trade fell through, but they were not done yet. The deal ended up as a burden to the Nets. In Brooklyn, they were running out of ideas. After all the trades, nothing seemed to work. But that's when Billy King made his most famous move, the one that would haunt the franchise for years. But before we get into that, think about this. If you were Billy King, would you have kept pushing for those big names? Could you have resisted the temptation to trade for instant success? This next move is when the real consequence begin hitting. Let's see the breakdown of the trade that changed everything for the Nets and why it still stings today. Billy King made move after move, trying to create a championship team by trading away the future. The Deron Williams trade, the Gerald Wallace trade, the Joe Johnson trade. None of these paid off, but then came the big one, the trade with the Boston Celtics. Fast forward to July of 2013. The Nets were moving forward with a decent playoff run, but they still needed more. So Billy King, he made a bold decision. This was going to be the big one, the trade for Paul Pierce, Kevin Garnett, and Jason Terry from the Boston Celtics. Now these players, although they were former champions, weren't in their prime anymore, but King believed that this was the move that would turn everything around. His idea was bringing in veteran stars to help the team compete for a championship. But what did the Nets give up? A lot. Gerald Wallace, who they just traded a year and a half prior, Chris Humphries, and an unprotected first-round pick in 2016, 2018, and a pick swap of 2017. The ultimate plan was to go all in for a title. The results, a total disaster that left the team broken for years. Pierce lasted only one season, and Garnett didn't stick around much longer. What was left? A team with no future, stuck with two old stars who were only going to get worse. And Billy King, his biggest mistake was thinking that those two aging stars could turn the Nets into contenders. It was a quick decision forced by pressure to make the championship. It was inevitable that this wasn't going to last, but no one expected it to fall apart this fast. But those draft picks that were traded off, that's where things really went wrong. To add salt to an already open wound, guess who was the pick that the Nets traded off to Boston for their aging champions? In 2016, they ended up selecting Jaylen Brown with the 3rd overall pick. And the very next year, they selected, with the 3rd overall pick once again, Jason Tatum. Yes, the two players that would eventually become all-stars and key parts of the Boston Celtics, who led the team to become a real championship contender as they were able to accomplish something that the Nets couldn't do, winning a championship as they did so by beating the Dallas Mavericks this past summer. And as for the Brooklyn Nets, they were left with nothing. No young talent, not even draft picks, nothing. Just a bunch of expensive contracts and a team that couldn't compete. The trade that set them back for years. Let me explain why this particular trade still hurts whenever it's thought of. A lot of people say that the Celtics took advantage of King's desperation and traded with their players who they knew were already out of shape in exchange for players who eventually catapult the team into contenders for the foreseeable future. Those same players they could have had if the Nets would have stayed patient along with Billy King. But here's where things get tricky. The players that King bought were not all worn out, as a lot of people would say. Yes, they were not going to last, but that deal was like one of King's best deals. And most people expected the same thing King expected. But looking back in hindsight, we have to ask, what was the problem with all of King's deals? Some reliable sources say the reason for these risky moves made by Billy King were a result of pressure from ownership, which he had faced when he became the general manager of the Brooklyn Nets. According to these sources, when Mikhail Prokhorov, a Russian billionaire, purchased the Brooklyn Nets, he made it clear. He didn't just want a competitive team. He wanted a championship fast. He said the Nets would win a title in 5 years. And his right-hand man, Dmitry Razumov, he backed up that pressure. And Billy King was under the gun. And time was ticking fast. Prokhorov's 5-year deadline put King in a tough spot. He had to choose between building for the future and getting results fast. And you have to wonder, what happens when a team picks speed over long-term success? But according to Billy King, when he made his defense about the Pierce-Garnett trade, he said that the deal was about bringing in stars to create a winning culture, one that would attract a future potential free agent in Kevin Durant. But honestly, that never made sense. Durant wasn't about to join the Nets in 2013. He had no reason to leave OKC at that time, and he wasn't going to come to Brooklyn just because of two aging players. The Nets weren't even close to the championship. King's reasoning now sounds like an excuse for a deal that failed badly. You could see the issues before the trade ever happened. There were a lot of sense to King's thinking. Some fans claim that if everything had gone according to plan, it could have worked. Pierce and Garnett weren't just players. They brought a winning mentality. If things had clicked, Brooklyn could have been on top. Plus the fact that then the idea wasn't as insane as it seems now. Could King have been more careful? Maybe, but it's hard to say what might have worked instead. Now let's jump forward to 2016. Sean Marks is in charge. The Nets are a mess, with no draft picks and limited resources. But Marks didn't panic. Instead, he focused on building slowly, finding undervalued talent, and developing young players. Guys like Karis LeVert, Jared Allen, and D'Angelo Russell started to shine under Marks' guidance. By 2019, the Nets weren't just competitive. They were a team on the rise. And eventually, they were able to bring in Kevin Durant along with Kyrie Irving that summer. And by then, the Nets, they were finally in a good place. But it wasn't because of Billy King's vision. It was because of smart and patient planning. Sean Marks had done what he can. He traded Mikal Bridges for a ton of future picks, which some see as a way to fix the past. However, the weight of that bad deal still lingers. Fans still feel like the team is stuck in a loop, constantly rebuilding but never getting ahead. The roster today is a mix of young players like Cam Thomas and veterans like Ben Simmons, who's still a gamble. Every game feels uncertain, not just who will step up, but whether they can hold it together. And as of today, the Brooklyn Nets are still in rebuilding stage with a disappointing 32-50 record just this past season. The hope of a future is totally on draft picks now. Sean Marks hopes that this new strategy will finally get them out of this mess that was caused by the trade from over a decade ago. So what if King hadn't made those trades? What if he kept those first-round picks and built a strong team from the ground up? Would the Nets have had superstars such as the likes of Lillard, Tatum, and Brown? Would they have been a real dynasty? We'll never know. But what we do know is this: Billy King's move made an impact on the NBA, just not in the way he had hoped. His decision helped the Boston Celtics become title contenders and kept Portland in the hunt while leaving Brooklyn in the dust. This tells a story of risk, failure, and missed opportunities. And this will be a continuous reminder that sometimes the biggest mistake is pushing too hard to win quickly, especially in the NBA. And as the fans, we can only wonder if it was all bad luck or if King was just blinded by the pressure to win too quickly.